thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. This is my first time in Australia, and I have found such a warm welcome here, and I have felt quite at home. I think there really is a connection between the American South in terms of sensibility and Australia. My mother, who is a little widow, lives in our country, out in the country in South Louisiana near the river. She told me before I left here, she said, now you could have been an Australian. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, your daddy was offered a job when we first got married in Australia, and I wanted to go, but he didn't want to leave his mama, so you were born here. So I'm here 52 years late, but I'm finally arrived, and it's been a marvelous trip. My closest friend back home in Louisiana is actually from Melbourne, and he said, oh, I'm so jealous you get to go back. You go back for him. He said, you got to go to the Melbourne cricket grounds. Now, I would have liked to have done that, but my children did a lot of research about Australia and said, Dad, the most dangerous spiders in the world live in Australia, and especially in Sydney. Well, I was so unnerved by the Sydney funnel spider that I was too afraid to go where the Melbourne crickets were. So I hope I did the right thing. But anyway, okay, I have to talk about something serious tonight, and I love nothing more than telling stories and having a good meal and having a drink and being with people. But we really are in this time and place in a critical crisis that's going to determine our future and the future of untold generations of people living in the West. The question that facing us now is, are we Rome? That is the West, by which I mean the nations that we used to call Christendom, are they on the verge of civilizational collapse as the Western Roman Empire did in the 5th century? Now, this is a question of immense relevance today. Though nobody foresees a material collapse, like has happened to Rome, the cultural, political, artistic, and religious heritage of Western civilization most certainly is in grave crisis. Last year's most important political book in the United States was titled Why Liberalism Failed by the Notre Dame political theorist Patrick Deneen. In it, Deneen argues that liberalism, by which he means the political and economic settlement under which we have been living more or less since the 19th century, liberalism is destroying itself. And it's doing so not because it has failed to achieve its ultimate goal, but paradoxically, because it has done very well at it. In Deneen's telling, a basic purpose of liberalism is to liberate the individual from all unchosen obligations. Its ultimate goal is to secure for the choosing individual the right to self-definition and autonomy. The anthropology of liberalism assumes no teleology, and in the classic view, liberty is the freedom to live virtuously. But in the modern liberal view, liberty is the right to define yourself as you choose, without reference to any outside tradition or authority. As the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy infamously put it in 1992, quote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life," unquote. Well, liberalism in both its conservative and progressive iterations has worked fairly well for the past 2 centuries, to say the least. So why is liberalism in mortal crisis now? Because liberalism depends on a cultural consensus that it cannot create. Justice Kennedy's remark, delivered in a majority Supreme Court opinion reaffirming the constitutional right to abortion, reveals the core instability at the heart of liberalism. What do you do when there is no longer a binding consensus of right and wrong, or even at the extremes, what it means to be human? Liberalism in all its forms, political, social, and economic, tends to atomize society. In Patrick Deneen's account, the liberal state presents itself as a neutral arbiter of competing claims, but without a widely shared pre-political sense of how those claims might be judged, the state has no choice but to enforce its own view as normative. And it turns out that the normative view is that held by power elites in the liberal state. So what happens when the elites become detached from the masses? In one sense, you might say what happened in Australia last weekend is one sign of what happens. But more crucially, we should ask ourselves what happens when ordinary politics becomes next to impossible because the masses of people don't share a common cultural basis within which they can settle disputes. That's what we're living through today. The contemporary philosopher Alistair MacIntyre said that we in the West are no longer living in a coherent tradition, but rather on incoherent fragments of tradition. We cannot settle political disputes, but only yell at each other because reasoning depends on a shared epistemological framework. For the West, this was Christianity, and since the Enlightenment, a secularized version of Christianity. Well, now that consensus is broken down. We are left only to yell at each other. In his 1982 book, After Virtue, MacIntyre famously compared our civilization to the civilization of late Rome. He said that a crucial turning point in Rome's decline and fall came when a significant minority of people stopped believing that their job was to shore up the empire, but rather they set about creating small local communities within which the life of virtue could survive a new dark ages ahead. MacIntyre said that today we await, quote, a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. This is where, for me, the idea of the Benedict option was born. The Benedict option, for those who don't know, is my latest book, and I've been traveling around Australia giving talks about it. It's my ideas for how Christians can live in a post-Christian civilization. Now, the choice, that is to say the option facing serious traditional Christians today, is whether or not the decline of the West has reached that turning point, the same one MacIntyre's talking about. Do we Christians continue working to shore up the current political, economic, and civilizational order? Or do we instead focus on more on building up alternative forms of Christian community within which the faith can be preserved through the present and the coming darkness? I believe that serious Christians have no real alternative but to choose the latter, to choose building up local communities. Now, that does not mean that Christians should head for the hills or to hive off from the world like Amish separatists. God bless the Amish, but that's not going to be the life for most of us. That's not feasible. It doesn't even mean that Christians should leave politics. I do not believe Christians should leave politics. But what it does mean is that Christians must make our first priority the shoring up of our faith and the institutions that embody the faith and pass it on to the next generations. As Robert Louis Wilken, a leading American Catholic historian of the early church, puts it, quote, "Nothing is more needful today than the survival of Christian culture, because in recent generations, this culture has become dangerously thin. At this moment in the church's history in this country and in the West more generally, it is less urgent to convince the alternative culture in which we live of the truth of Christ than it is for the church to tell itself its own story and to nurture its own life, the culture of the city of God, the Christian republic. This is not going to happen without a rebirth of moral and spiritual discipline and a resolute effort on the part of Christians to comprehend and to defend the remnants of Christian culture." That was Robert Louis Wilken. And that's why I wrote The Benedict Option. It's a book written as a prophetic warnings to Christians in the West, that if we don't act now and act boldly to strengthen ourselves in the traditional Christian faith, then that faith will disappear. The handwriting is on the wall. Now, I wrote that book as a traditional conservative Christian for traditional conservative Christians. But my message is not strictly religious. I'm deeply concerned not only about the decline of the churches, but of Western civilization more generally. Though I am a believer, and though I am confident that only a genuine religious revival can reinvigorate the West today, I nevertheless stand strongly with non-believers and non-Christians who cherish the civilizational history of the West, our culture. Indeed, most of my fellow Christians fail to understand the meaning and the priceless value of the patrimony that has come down to us from Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem. The Christian faith is a universal creed, to be sure, but for us, it has been articulated through particular peoples at particular times. Tradition is not the same thing as traditionalism, which the late historian Yaroslav Pelikan described as, quote, the dead faith of the living. We really should not try to restore any sort of golden age. That's not possible. But rather, we must continue a living relationship, in fact, a kind of conversation with our ancestors. Their stories are our stories too. Our life together right now is writing a new chapter in the long narrative of Western civilization. It's a chapter that, frankly, includes non-Western peoples. Last Saturday here in Sydney, I met an immigrant from China, a Christian convert, who told me how much he has come to love and appreciate and treasure the sense of justice and mercy and respect for the individual that he has discovered in the West. Now, the ideals of Western civilization came to us through the peoples of the Mediterranean and Northern Europe, but I believe that anyone who affirms these truths and values is a friend of the West, whatever their ethnic background. It's very important to recognize that and to state it clearly in a time when some people on the far right are asserting that Western civilization is a racial thing. It's not. One reason why many and even most Christians are unaware that we are living through the religious and cultural equivalent of the great flood of the Bible is that this time of catastrophe is certainly a time of catastrophe, but it's a particular kind of catastrophe, one that is completely obliterating the old order, including all the institutions of Christianity that many of us grew up with. The floodwaters can be understood as liquid modernity. Now, this is a phrase coined by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman to describe the quality of constant change characteristic of our time. For Bauman, modernity was solid in the sense that a definite and radical change had been set in motion when modernity started, but that change happened at a rate that was absorbable, that people could adjust to. People could get used to the changes, and life itself felt solid. But at some point in the 19th, and certainly by the 20th century, the rate of change sped up so fast that modernity became liquid. That is, before this or that change took a solid form, things changed again. To live in liquid modernity is to experience life as having no fixed landmarks or pathways. You can go wherever your desires take you. Liquid modernity has caused the loss of tradition, religious and otherwise. It has fomented the dissolution of bonds among people, a loss of shared authority, as well as a sense of connection to the past and to the future. And it has terribly compromised the ability of people to reason together, and therefore to live together in peace. People have come to see truth as whatever feels true to them. This is what the philosopher Alistair McIntyre calls emotivism. You can't argue with someone's feelings, and if you can't argue with someone's feelings, then how can you settle disputes? You can't, except through the raw exercise of power. There are two pseudo-religions in liquid modernity that take the place once held by Christianity. One is an ersatz Christianity called moralistic therapeutic deism. It was called that by the sociologist who is the leading expert on it. Though it uses the language and the institutions of Christianity, MTD is nothing more than an assertion that God wants us to be happy and nice to other people. This, and nothing much more than that. We only need to call on God when we need something from him. And hell, if it exists at all, is for people like Hitler and nobody else. And that's moralistic therapeutic deism. This is the de facto religion of most young Americans, whatever their professed creed, Catholic, Protestant, what have you. This is not just an opinion. This has been demonstrated in the sociologist Christian Smith's extensive work among American Christians. Now, the other fake religion is far more militant and hard-edged. This is the religion of social justice, and it has taken over many academic institutions in our society, as well as much of the news media and elite corporations. It has conquered it as thoroughly as Calvinism conquered Geneva in the Reformation. What is the religion of social justice? Well, I have to cheat a bit. The academics James Lindsay and Mike Nana, in a 2018 essay in the magazine Areo, say that the social justice phenomenon is like a religion. Lindsay and Nana define the social justice phenomenon like this, quote, "One, it references a manner of approaching social justice relevant topics through a rather inflexible moral ideology that is most readily identifiable with identity politics and political correctness, along with the more recent buzzworded concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Specifically, I'm quoting them still, specifically, this is a social philosophy profoundly concerned with effecting liberation from oppression, with oppression defined by what is known as postmodern critical theory. Two, it represents the loose coalitions of people who subscribe to this ostensibly progressive view of identity and society. These people have been variously called regressive leftists, identitarians, and more pejoratively, social justice warriors, SJWs, in common parlance over the last half-decade. The authors go on to say that social justice exhibits many religion-like qualities, perhaps enough to earn it that designation. I should say that James Lindsay's colleague, Helen Pluckrose, is going to be the next speaker in this series, and I strongly urge you to come out and hear what she has to say. As far as I know, she's a secular leftist, but she sees the problem with the religion of social justice and is standing up against it. Social justice is like a religion because it provides an explanation for why the world has gone wrong, a vivid and forceful prescription for how to make it right, and a strong sense of purpose and community among the elect. Unlike Christianity, the religion of social justice is not burdened with a sense of human frailty. Nobody is more convinced of his own righteousness than a social justice warrior. Now, if you've ever had to deal with the social justice warriors, you all know too well how hysterical and self-righteous they can be. The difference between social justice warriors and terrorists is that you can usually negotiate with a terrorist. SJWs, who, again, hold the high ground in the leading institutions of Western culture today, are driven by the same monomania that recurs in truly revolutionary movements, from the Jacobins to the Bolsheviks to the Maoists. As Sir Roger Scruton, a recent victim of the SJWs, put it, everything that does not conform to the egalitarian goal is to be pulled down and destroyed. In this way, social justice becomes a barely concealed demand for the clean sweep of history that revolutionaries have always attempted. One way of understanding barbarism is as a condition in which cultural memory has been obliterated. In this sense, modernity itself is a way of thinking and being that induces barbarism. This is because a core purpose of modernity is to liberate the desiring individual from any unchosen obligations to a history, a people, a religion, or a way of life. In advanced modernity, everybody is, in theory, a lump of clay that molds himself. The religion of social justice fits into that perfectly. The Cambridge University social anthropologist Paul Connerton has written profoundly about the modern condition and the loss of cultural memory, what it means for us. He writes that, quote, "Our experience of the present very largely depends upon our knowledge of the past, and that participants in any social order must presuppose a shared memory. When a new regime or revolutionary social order takes over," says Connerton, "the first thing it does is to try to sever the community's connection to the past. ISIS has been doing that in the past few years in areas it controls by erasing any physical embodiment of the memory of those areas' pre-Islamic past." Connerton says, quote, "The more total the aspirations of the new regime, the more imperiously will it seek to introduce an era of forced forgetting. An era of forced forgetting. ISIS is an extreme example, of course, but this happens in all societies that are undergoing revolutionary change. The communist regimes of Russia and Eastern Europe tried this too. Speaking of those societies, Connerton writes that, quote, there were people there who realized that the struggle of citizens against state power is a struggle of their memory against forced forgetting. A people that has been forced to forget its culture is a people who are easier to control. Our liberty depends on maintaining our cultural memory. This is one of the fundamental lessons of totalitarianism. In communist societies, just like as in revolutionary France, the masses had their cultural memories and institutions and practices persecuted, denied, and when possible, washed from their brains. In our society, the chief agents attempting to accomplish this kind of barbarization are the social justice warriors within universities, within media, within corporate diversity offices, law, and other institutions. It is not primarily coming from the government. It is coming from the institutions of civil society. These are the new barbarians among us. We rarely recognize how radical they are, and that's partly why they're so effective. We have not mounted yet a meaningful defense. I've been following the struggle that the Ramsay Center has had with some of the SJWs within universities here. I'm relieved to hear that the study of Western civilization still has friends in high places in universities, among some faculty, and indeed of students who want their heritage. They too, these people in universities, our friends, are engaged in a great struggle, a struggle simply for the right to engage with and learn from the legacy of this civilization which formed us. Not an uncritical adoration of Western civilization. There were some bad things that happened. That's part of the story too. But people have the right to learn about it and to engage with it. I will give the social justice warriors credit. They are nothing if not committed to their revolutionary creed. They don't think that we who cherish Western civilization are merely wrong. They think that we're evil. And you do not compromise with evil. This is a sacred belief for them, and it's not one to be questioned. SJWs have captured some of the churches in the West. When I was visiting Harvard recently, I observed that nearly all of the churches near the campus fly the rainbow flag, and they have Black Lives Matter signs featured prominently out front. Now, whatever you might think of gay rights or Black Lives Matter, the fact that liberal Protestant churches now identify themselves primarily through their commitment to these social justice warrior causes, that's really significant. It's not that they take these in as part of the Christian faith, but they put these out front, more prominent than crosses. On the other hand, liberal Protestant churches are only marginally influential in American society, and they're declining rapidly. SJWs have captured many and perhaps most major corporations. In the name of inclusivity and diversity, they are directing hiring and firing practices and policing discourse and behavior in the workplace to an unprecedented degree. This is significant because SJWs have the power to make or break people's careers for ideological reasons, and because major corporations are no longer reticent about exercising their power to affect social justice legislation. American social conservatives like me met our Waterloo in April of 2015 when big business involved itself for the first time in a major way in the culture war by threatening to punish the state of Indiana over a religious liberty law that progressives called anti-LGBT. The state backed down, and a principle, a line had been drawn, a powerful line, and that established the future for religious liberty and the state. As important as the SJW capture of corporations is, it's not the worst thing. That these radicals have control, or at least great influence in Western universities, however, is a calamity whose seriousness can scarcely be overstated. Universities are the chief institutions through which knowledge is preserved, generated, and disseminated. James Lindsay and Mike Nana point out that the capture of the universities in our secular society is especially worrying for a reason that might have escaped many of us. They write, religions in secular socio-political environments are forced to treat their beliefs as beliefs. Social justice has arranged things such that it can treat its beliefs as knowledge. As we've seen, social justice is like a religion in that many of its claims are non-falsifiable. Universities under social justice control, or at least university faculties under SJW control, they operate like cathedrals and a clergy and seminaries of an alternative religion. That they operate under the pretense that they represent objective knowledge is a clear threat to the future of Western civilization. As Lindsay and Nana write, by seeking to conquer educational institutions first, social justice has effected a social and cultural coup that religious hardliners have only been able to dream about for most of the past century. I should say these guys are secular liberals themselves, and they worry about secular liberalism under this new order. Regarding social justice as an alternative religion and universities as cathedrals and seminaries of this religion compels those who are passionately committed to preserving and advocating for the Western tradition to think and to strategize in radically different ways. Many of us have thought that the fight was a matter of persuasive reason. You make our arguments, you contend, and may the best man win. But reason, as we understand it, doesn't matter to the social justice warriors. Reason is only a tool through which the oppressor justifies and advances his oppression. To use the colloquial expression, when we try to reason with these people, we're bringing a knife to a gunfight. If this battle for institutions is unwinnable, at least for the foreseeable future, what should we do? It's here that the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre and the example of the early Benedictine monks, they have something to teach us. In his 1981 book, A Moral Philosophy After Virtue, MacIntyre surveyed the bleak postmodern landscape of moral discourse and likened our current period, yes, to the fall of the Roman Empire in the West and the entrance of the West into the so-called Dark Ages. MacIntyre concludes his book like this. A crucial turning point in that earlier history, that is the fall of Rome, occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. What they set themselves to achieve instead, often not fully recognizing what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. Now, MacIntyre here is talking about the early Benedictine monasteries. St. Benedict, who was born 4 years after the last Western emperor was deposed, founded his monasteries in the 6th century, early 6th century. In his rule, Benedict calls these monasteries, quote, schools for the Lord's service. He regarded them as communities of formation and discipleship through education and practice. Those monasteries were not simply places of prayer and worship, though that was certainly at the absolute heart of what they did. They were also places where practical knowledge that had been lost to civilization when Rome fell was preserved and passed on to the peoples living in the areas where the monks planted monasteries. It's incredible to imagine that people back then forgot how to garden, forgot how to build things, and how to make ordinary things when the Roman order fell. But the archaeological record is clear on this. The early Benedictines not only seeded barbarian-ruled Western Europe with faith, but also with lost knowledge. And crucially for our purposes tonight, the Benedictines preserved within their monasteries, monastery libraries, books that carried within their pages the cultural memory of Greco-Roman civilization. The monks copied and recopied both sacred and profane works. Over time, the monks founded the first schools in medieval Europe and began educating leaders for the emerging civilizational order. The knowledge that the monks preserved in their living communities became the basis for the refounding of Western civilization. This is why some scholars regard the rule of St. Benedict as second only to the Bible as the most influential book in Western history. The early Benedictine monasteries were preservers of cultural memory because in the worst times, they kept the tradition alive within their monastery walls, and later, when the barbaric tide began to recede, because they spread that preserved knowledge to their students who are working and living in the world. Now, Alistair McIntyre says the world awaits a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. Well, let's ask ourselves, what would a St. Benedict of the 21st century do to preserve the Western civilizational tradition amid this current barbarism? Where are the 21st century equivalents of the Dark Age monasteries? I propose to you that they are and they must be colleges and schools, high schools and elementary schools that fully embrace and celebrate the Western humanist tradition from the Greeks and the Romans through the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Reformation on through the age of science and enlightenment. There are a few of those colleges and schools now. Campion College here in Australia is one, and we have a few in the US. And in America, at least, the burgeoning classical Christian schooling movement is resurrecting the study of the classics and the great books of the Western tradition for students in elementary and high school. Now, men and women of goodwill who love the Western tradition and who feel a deep responsibility to preserve cultural memory and to pass on our cultural patrimony, we should think very hard about the value of trying to shore up the Imperium. That is, we should consider whether or not the continuation of moral, intellectual, and artistic life of Western civilization is consonant with engaging these institutions. We need to give very serious thought to constructing new forms of community within which the intellectual and cultural life and legacy of the West can be sustained through this present and coming age of darkness. I'll put it to you bluntly. If most of today's universities are overrun by social justice warriors, and if they are determined to turn their back on Western civilization and to assert themselves and to proclaim themselves to be mortal enemies of Western thought and civilization, then we have no choice but to shake the dust off our feet and to strengthen those universities and faculties and institutions that stand and to construct new ones. To be clear, I don't believe we're there yet. We are not there yet. But we can't afford to be naively optimistic about the long term. Now is a time for creative strategic thinking. When St. Benedict died in the year 547, he left only a handful of monasteries around the vicinity of Rome. But over the next 3 and 4 centuries, the monastic movement took off across Western Europe because it spoke to a felt need of the people. The monasteries were like an army of stars thrown into the sky of Dark Ages Europe, and they ended up saving civilization. Note well, St. Benedict did not set out to save civilization or to make Rome great again. All he wanted to do was to figure out a way to live in faithful Christian community in a time of great chaos and trial. Everything he accomplished in terms of saving civilization followed from his determination to search for God in community in an ordered way. For us, if Western civilization is to be saved, it will be saved in large part because men and women who love the tradition do anything they can to save it. We have to work within the institutions that we have, and I praise the work Ramsay has done to that effect. But we must also be creative and proactive and establish countercultural institutions to preserve and to pass on that cultural memory. It's not an either or, but a both and. This is the challenge of our time. This is not only the challenge of our time, but it's also a great adventure. I'll end with this 1980s era passage from the late American Catholic novelist Walker Percy, who wrote it in his nonfiction book, Lost in the Cosmos. This, I believe, characterizes what we defenders of the West are facing today. Percy writes, imagine you are a member of a tour visiting Greece. The group goes to the Parthenon. It is a bore. Few people even bother to look. It looked better in the brochure. So people take half a look, mostly take pictures, or mark on serious erosion by acid rain. You're puzzled. Why should one of the glories and fonts of Western civilization, viewed under pleasant conditions, good weather, good hotel room, good food, good guide, why should that be a bore? Now imagine under what set of circumstances a viewing of the Parthenon would not be a bore. For example, you're a NATO colonel defending Greece against a Soviet assault. You're in a bunker in downtown Athens, binoculars propped up on sandbags. It is dawn. A medium-range missile attack is underway. 500,000 Greeks are dead. 2 missiles bracket the Parthenon. The next will surely be a hit. Between columns of smoke, a ray of golden light catches the portico. Are you bored? Can you see the Parthenon? Explain. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, can you see the Parthenon in the sense that Walker Percy means? Most of us have looked upon the relics and the artifacts of Western civilization, the art, the culture, the philosophy, and so forth, with the disengagement of tourists on a sunny day. In fact, the reality of the conflict we're in now is more like the second scenario, with a missile attack upon Athens from armed modern barbarians. Can you see how sacred is this civilizational patrimony that it is our honor and our privilege and our responsibility to defend? We cannot afford to be passive bystanders. We have to act, and we have to act boldly while there is still time. Thank you very much.